Well, inflation has been a huge topic of conversation in recent years, and its impact on retirement planning is arguably as big as it's ever been. So, what can you do to inflation proof your retirement in 2025? We'll talk about that next with Mike Coynan. Welcome into Retirement Reality. I'm Ben George with Mike Coynan over at Principal Preservation Services. And Mike, I know inflation's calmed down some, right? I mean, we're 2, 3, I think, percent right now. Obviously, a couple of years ago, we were touching 8. Everybody was really alarmed and freaking out and anxious about everything. But even when it has settled back down, it still can be a big problem for retirement, right?
It's a huge problem. And when we look at, I think it was June of 22, inflation was up to 9.1%. Wow. So what that means for Americans is we've recently seen some gas prices come down, but the gas prices increase, the cost of just going out to eat, the cost of just going to the grocery store, the cost of goods are so much higher. They say the cost of goods today, the end of 2024 compared to 2020 is 20% higher. So that's where families are spending anywhere from $500 to $1,000 a month more just to live the same lifestyle as they used to. So it's been hard on a lot of families.
Well, Mike is the founder and owner of Principal Preservation Services. If you want to talk more about inflation proofing after we get done with this conversation today, text the word retire to 21,000. You can start building out your retirement reality roadmap. All right, Mike. So when we talk about, things are changing with retirement planning as it relates to inflation. How have you seen it change the way your clients are planning right now for their future with inflation in mind?
Yeah. So when we use our software, when we do planning, we are factoring in, the 100-year average rate of inflation, which is like 3.27 is the 100-year average, I believe it is. Okay. And so, but we can adjust that. So years that we had higher inflation, we jumped that up. We jumped that up to what the rate was at the time. So we can adjust that because, if you need, maybe 4 years ago, you needed $6,000 a month today. And as we're noticed, as inflation has creep down, I looked today, I think it was right around 3.3%, which is right around the 100-year average. The price of goods really haven't dropped much, right? Maybe cars have dropped a little bit, but they're not back to where they were. Food has come down hardly at all. Gas is maybe a little bit. So things are changing as we notice, just like as we had those building spike increases after COVID, they really haven't dropped back down to where the prices were prior to COVID, right? So people got used to, spending the money as well. So we are factoring, at least for the planning, that 100-year average, because we want to be somewhat realistic to make sure that, because we know Social Security doesn't keep up with inflation and pensions don't keep up with inflation. Most of them don't have any inflation protection on there at all. So we want to be realistic, make sure your investments are growing enough to combat inflation.
So even in years, because we had a long stretch where inflation was 1, 2, 3%. So even in those years where nobody's talking about it, nobody's really thinking about inflation, you guys are still working in and factoring that 3.3% kind of average as you're working with your clients?
Absolutely. Yeah. We want to plan for the worst, hope for the best is our motto here. We want to make sure that if we have any kind of, change in costs, we want to make sure if their expenses today are $6,000 a month, I'd rather be on the heavy side. And let's plan for a bigger monthly expenses, $6,200, $6,500. I'd rather be in the high end, high side rather than on the low side when it comes to that. But also, even keeping that inflationary rate at the 100-year average, even those years has come down, and we'll see what those will be as President Trump talks about getting interest rates back down. So I think it should be more favorable in the next few years.
All right. So that gives you an idea of how they work with clients to plan for inflation, even when we're not talking about it, right? When it's kind of in the background. But to help kind of paint this picture, Mike, what impact does that have? Because I know we're trying to plan for retirement for most people for 30, even 40 years in some cases, right? So what impact will inflation have over a plan over that long-term lifespan?
Yeah. And when we look at, and I've seen some plans done by other financial advisors, they don't factor in any cost of living adjustment, which I think is ridiculous because we know that's not true, right? But on the same side, they're also factoring an average return of 8%, which is not very realistic as well. No cost of living on the expenses, but high average returns. Let's be a little bit more realistic. So what happens if we have a 3% inflation cost of living adjustment, it takes your expenses will double in about 24 years, right? So if you're spending, $6,000 a month, 24 years later with inflation, now you're going to be 12,000. But our software will show that if inflation is 4%, if we have a little bit higher than the average, your expenses will double every 18 years. Okay, so now you got 36 years. Now you got 6,000. Now it's 12. Now you spend 24,000 possibly on your expenses. And if inflation is 5%, every 14 and a half years, your expenses will double. So it's important to make sure that those shortfalls, because inflation, if Social Security is averaging 2.2% below inflation, if you have a pension from a private company, like right down the road, we have 3M, they don't have cost of living adjustments on those pensions. It's a zero. Unless you work for the government, those are usually 1.5, 2 anyways. They're not keeping up with inflation. You have to make sure your investments are going to provide that difference.
All right, let's talk about investments then, Mike, for anyone that's thinking about, okay, I'm worried about inflation. I just want to make sure I'm keeping up and outpacing it. What are some investments then or strategies that you typically recommend to people you work with to kind of offset this inflation problem?
Yeah, the biggest issue we had in high inflation the last few years has been people have been holding on to bonds. You are not supposed to be investing in bonds in high inflationary periods. The only way you beat and combat inflation is with equities. And we've seen way too many people with too much of their portfolio in bonds. And especially as interest rates climb, bond values decrease, equities are what you should be investing. Now, that's a tough thing to do if you retire or close to retirement. Say, I want to be aggressive in equities. Maybe that doesn't fit your risk tolerance as well. There are better investments out there than bonds, in my opinion, that give you better returns without losses due to the interest rate environment. And that's what we utilize is the accumulation index annuities. You can get right now, as we speak, 8.5% caps on the S&P. You can 8.5% in the good years with zeros on the down years. What are the bond yields right now? 3.5 to 4.25 with losses. These index annuities have better gains than that with no losses. So those are some options out there for people to combat inflation.
And that's important, right? Because I think a lot of people are conservative and don't want to, put their money at risk, especially in retirement, and thinking about, okay, I have to outpace inflation can probably create some issues for people just in terms of trying to have the mindset of, okay, I've got to be a little more aggressive than maybe I want to be.
Yeah, exactly. And, recent client even, we've just in here just last couple of days here, last week, and 40% of their portfolio was in bonds. They were 60-40 blend that, is that old kind of narrative from a while ago that really hasn't changed. It should change because it shows that you should have 60% equities and 40% bonds. And what has happened the last few years? Well, the equities have recovered and then some. And then what's happened to the bonds? They just drop, and they haven't recovered. When I pulled up one of their bonds in their portfolios, they were down 35% in the last 5 years in a bond fund. And most people don't carry individual bonds anymore. They're carrying bond funds because now the advisors can charge you a fee on that, and they change daily. And it's different, multiple bonds in it, different maturity dates, different yields, but they're not performing very well. So we're able to get them out of the bonds and get them into a portfolio that is lower risk on the downside, better returns on the upside, but also get it out of those bonds into a zero losses, better gains on those as well. So essentially, if we were to have a bad recession again, let's call it 40, 50%, the S&P lost, part of the money is actively managed with a limited loss and the other has zero losses. We can limit their whole portfolio to a worst case 10% loss. That is a great place to be. And now what happens? The market, we have a bad year, you're down 10%. Nobody wants to lose anything, but now it only takes 11.2% to get their money back. It gives you a lot more peace of mind as opposed to this client was going to be a 30% loss. They're going to have to make 43% returns to get their money back. It's a 9-day difference.
It's the reason why you plan. You don't know what options are out there many times when you're trying to do it by yourself. So having a financial professional like Mike on your side to help build out that investment strategy that's going to work for you, that meets, what your comfort level is with risk, with what your goals are, or where you need to be. So again, if you want to begin building out your retirement reality roadmap, you can do that. Just simply text the word retire to 21,000. Again, retire to 21,000. And you'll begin doing that process very soon. So we appreciate you watching. Again, if you haven't subscribed to us on YouTube, please do that. If you're listening to us on the podcast and aren't watching on YouTube, come on over to the channel. A lot of great content. We're putting out new shows every single week. So we'll talk to you again here on Retirement Reality.
Investment advisory services offered through Alpha Star Capital Management, LLC, an SEC-registered investment advisor. SEC registration does not constitute an endorsement of the firm by the Commission, nor does it indicate that the advisor has attained a particular level of skill or ability. Alpha Star, Principal Preservation Services, LLC, and Principal Wealth Services, LLC are separate and independent entities. Insurance products are offered through Principal Preservation Services, LLC, a Minnesota and Wisconsin insurance agency. Investment advice is offered through Principal Wealth Services, LLC. Any comments regarding safe and secure investments and guaranteed income streams refer only to fixed insurance products offered by Principal Preservation Services, LLC. They do not refer in any way to securities or investment advisory products. Fixed insurance and annuity product guarantees are subject to the claims paying ability of the issuing company and are not offered or guaranteed by Alpha Star.